The day I buried my son was the day my daughter-in-law threw me out of his house. I was still wearing black from the funeral when Lauren Parker opened the front door, dragged my old suitcase across the floor, and shoved it onto the porch. My son Daniel had been gone for less than 48 hours, and already she was looking at me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. "You should go, Margaret," she said coldly. "This house is mine now." I stood there numb, staring at the door that closed between us. What Lauren didn't know was that the quiet old woman she had just thrown into the street owned the company where she worked. And sooner or later, the truth would walk through her office doors. If this story already makes your heart ache, take a moment to like the video so more people can find it. And if you believe family betrayal is one of the deepest wounds a person can face, consider subscribing to the channel. But before we continue, I'm curious about something. Where are you watching this story from today? And what time is it there right now? Sometimes knowing someone out there is listening makes telling a painful story a little easier. My name is Margaret Miller. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, people have underestimated me. Not because I tried to fool anyone, it's simply because I never cared much for appearances. I live quietly in Connecticut in a modest colonial-style home surrounded by old maple trees. If you saw me at the grocery store, you'd probably assume I was just another retired widow buying soup and fresh bread for the week. I don't wear expensive jewelry. I drive a 10-year-old sedan. I prefer comfortable sweaters over designer clothes. That's exactly how I like it. But the truth is, the quiet life I live today was built on decades of hard work, risk, and more sleepless nights than I can count. 40 years ago, when my husband passed away, suddenly I was left with a 5-year-old boy and a mountain of uncertainty. His name was Daniel Miller. He was the center of my world from the moment he was born. Even as a child, Daniel had the gentlest heart I had ever seen. He was the kind of boy who would rescue injured birds, share his lunch with classmates, and apologize even when something wasn't his fault. When his father died, he became my reason to keep going. I remember the night after the funeral. Daniel sat at the kitchen table swinging his small legs beneath the chair, trying to understand why his father wasn't coming home. "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" he asked. I looked at that little boy with his wide eyes full of trust, and I knew I had no choice but to say yes. Yes, I told him, even though I had no idea how. That promise shaped the rest of my life. Back then, we had very little. I worked 2 jobs while Daniel was young, accounting during the day, bookkeeping for small businesses at night. Slowly, I started helping local companies manage their finances. Then a small investment opportunity came along. I took a chance on it. That chance became another, then another. Over time, those small risks turned into something bigger than I ever imagined. What started as a tiny financial consulting service eventually grew into Miller Holdings, a private investment group that now owns stakes in dozens of companies across the country. But I never changed my lifestyle much. Daniel grew up watching me work long hours, but I made sure he never felt deprived. We had dinners together every night. We talked about school, about life, about dreams. And Daniel had big dreams. He didn't want to work in finance like I did. Instead, he fell in love with architecture. He loved designing buildings that made people feel something, homes filled with sunlight, community centers where families could gather, spaces that made life better. I couldn't have been prouder of him. By the time Daniel graduated from college, I had already stepped back from most of the day-to-day operations of my company. My executive team handled much of the work, though the final decisions still passed through me. Daniel never cared much about the business side of my life. To him, I was just Mom. He used to joke about it sometimes. "You know, Mom," he said once with a smile, "you could run the entire economy and still forget to charge your phone." He wasn't wrong, but Daniel always respected what I had built, and I respected the path he chose for himself. When he was 32, he met Lauren Parker. I still remember the first time he told me about her. We were sitting at a small Italian restaurant near his apartment in Boston. Daniel had that familiar spark in his eyes, the one he used to get whenever something or someone made him truly happy. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said casually. "Oh," I replied, pretending not to notice the excitement in his voice. "Her name is Lauren. We met at a networking event. She works in financial consulting." I raised an eyebrow. "Financial consulting sounds dangerous." Daniel laughed. "Don't worry, she's nothing like you." That made me laugh too. A few weeks later, Daniel invited Lauren to dinner at my house. She arrived with a bottle of wine and a polite smile. Lauren was in her early 30s, tall, well-dressed, with confident posture and sharp eyes that seemed to observe everything around her. From the moment she stepped inside, she knew exactly how to make a good impression. She complimented my cooking. She asked thoughtful questions about Daniel's childhood. She listened carefully whenever someone spoke. On the surface, she seemed warm and respectful. But even during that first dinner, I noticed something subtle. Lauren asked a lot of questions about finances. Not directly about my wealth, but about investments, about real estate markets, about retirement portfolios. They were framed as professional curiosity, the kind you'd expect from someone working in finance. Still, something about the way she asked them felt calculated. At the time, I pushed that thought aside. After all, Daniel looked happy. And that mattered more to me than anything. Over the next year, their relationship moved quickly. Lauren was ambitious-driven and very focused on building a successful life. Daniel admired that about her. He used to say she helped him think bigger about the future. Eventually, Daniel proposed. Their wedding was small and elegant. Lauren had wanted something larger at first, but Daniel preferred a quiet ceremony with close friends and family. I paid for the wedding, though I never made a big announcement about it. In fact, that was something I had always been careful about. I never wanted Daniel or anyone in his life to feel like they were living in the shadow of my success. So I kept most details about my business private. Even Lauren only knew that I had done well financially over the years. She didn't know the scale of it, and I preferred it that way. After the wedding, Daniel and Lauren bought a beautiful home just outside Boston. Lauren believed they had secured an excellent mortgage through a favorable bank program. What she never realized was that the investment fund behind that mortgage quietly belonged to one of my subsidiaries. I helped them without taking any credit for it. That's how I'd always loved my son, quietly, without asking for recognition. For a while, their life together seemed happy. Daniel was thriving in his architecture firm, designing residential buildings and community spaces. Lauren was climbing the corporate ladder at a consulting company called Reed Financial Consulting. Whenever we had dinner together, Daniel talked excitedly about new projects, new ideas, new plans. Lauren often talked about promotions, networking events, and career opportunities. She liked success. She liked status. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. But over time, I began to notice small things. Lauren sometimes made subtle comments about money. She compared houses. She talked about the lifestyles of her colleagues. She occasionally asked Daniel whether he planned to expand his business or invest more aggressively. Daniel usually laughed those questions off. He wasn't driven by wealth. He was driven by purpose. Still, I told myself I might be imagining things. Maybe I was simply being overprotective. Daniel was an adult. He had chosen his partner. And for a while, I truly believed everything would be fine. I had no idea that only a few years later I would be standing on their porch with a suitcase in my hand, while the woman Daniel loved looked at me as if I were nothing more than an obstacle, or that the company where she proudly worked every day already belonged to me. For the first year after Daniel and Lauren got married, everything looked normal, at least on the surface. They moved into their new home just outside Boston, a beautiful 2-story house with large windows, a small backyard, and a quiet neighborhood that Daniel loved the moment he saw it. He used to talk about how much natural light the house had, how the layout felt open and welcoming. See this corner, he once told me, standing in the living room with his hands on his hips like a proud designer. Perfect reading spot. Lauren rolled her eyes playfully. Or perfect place for a bar cart. Daniel laughed. Moments like that reassured me. They seemed happy. They teased each other the way couples do when they're comfortable together. And I wanted to believe that was enough. I visited often during that first year. Not too often. I had learned long ago that newly married couples needed their space. But every few weeks, Daniel would invite me over for dinner. Sometimes he cooked. Sometimes Lauren did. Lauren was polite during those visits. Always welcoming, always smiling, always offering coffee or dessert. But there was something about the way she observed things that made me quietly uneasy. She paid attention to details, not emotional details, financial ones. One evening, we were sitting at the dining table after dinner when Lauren casually asked a question that seemed harmless at first. "So, Margaret," she said, swirling the wine in her glass, "Daniel mentioned you used to work in finance. Are you fully retired now?" I nodded, more or less. I still stay involved in some investments. Lauren leaned forward slightly. What kind of investments? Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp. I smiled politely. Oh, a little of everything. Real estate, private equity, things like that. She seemed intrigued. That sounds impressive, she said. The financial world is incredibly competitive. Daniel chuckled. Trust me, Lauren. My mom could probably run circles around half the people in your office. Lauren laughed, but there was something else behind the laugh. Something that lingered a little too long. From that moment on, I noticed she asked similar questions whenever we met. Never directly about my money, but about markets, about company ownership, about how investment groups operated. At first, I assumed it was professional curiosity. Lauren worked in consulting after all. Those topics were part of her world. Still, I kept my answers vague, not because I didn't trust Daniel, but because I'd learned long ago that the moment people understood exactly how much influence you had, everything about their behavior changed. And I didn't want that kind of attention inside my family. A few months later, Lauren began talking more about her job. She worked at a company called Reed Financial Consulting. It was a mid-sized firm specializing in corporate financial strategy, risk analysis, and investment planning for growing businesses. Daniel seemed proud of her. She's doing really well, he told me once over the phone. Her manager says she's on track for a promotion next year. I congratulated him. Lauren, for her part, spoke about her job with enthusiasm and sometimes with a hint of frustration. The problem with corporate environments, she said one evening, is that the people at the top are always disconnected from what's actually happening. Daniel shrugged. That's probably true everywhere. Lauren continued, clearly passionate about the topic. If I ever ran a company, I'd do things very differently. I simply listened. What Lauren didn't know was that Reed Financial Consulting wasn't an independent firm. 3 years earlier, Miller Holdings had quietly acquired a controlling interest in the company through one of our investment branches. It was a strategic move, nothing dramatic, nothing public, just another addition to a portfolio of dozens of businesses across different industries. Lauren had no idea, and at that point I saw no reason to tell her. As far as she knew, Reed Financial Consulting was just another consulting firm with distant investors somewhere in the background. The irony of the situation didn't fully register with me until much later. Back then, I simply thought it was an interesting coincidence. Life moved forward. Daniel's architecture career continued to flourish. He was working on several residential projects and had recently begun collaborating with a nonprofit organization to design affordable housing developments. He was proud of that work. Buildings should help people, he once told me, not just make investors rich. I smiled when he said that. Careful, I replied. You're talking to an investor. He grinned. You're different. Those were some of my favorite moments with Daniel. Conversations that reminded me the boy I raised, the kind, thoughtful boy, was still there. Lauren, meanwhile, became increasingly focused on her career path. Promotions, networking events, corporate visibility. She began attending industry conferences and business dinners. She talked frequently about colleagues who had advanced faster than she had. I should already be at the senior associate level, she told Daniel one night, while we were having dinner together. Honestly, some of the people above me are far less capable. Daniel didn't argue. He just listened patiently. That was Daniel's nature. He believed in people, sometimes more than they deserved. Still, there were many evenings when things felt normal, comfortable, even warm. Lauren hosted holiday dinners. We celebrated Daniel's birthday together. We took a small family trip to Vermont one autumn to see the leaves change color. During that trip, I remember standing on a wooden deck overlooking the mountains while Daniel and Lauren talked inside the cabin. Their voices carried through the open door. Lauren was speaking. I just think we could aim higher, she was saying. Bigger house, better neighborhood, a stronger financial plan. Daniel replied calmly. We're doing fine, Lauren, but fine isn't the same as successful. There was a pause. Then Daniel spoke again gently. I'm already happy. I didn't step inside. I stood there quietly looking out at the mountains, pretending I hadn't heard the conversation. But something about Lauren's words stayed with me. They weren't cruel. They weren't even unreasonable. Ambition, after all, is not a bad thing. But there was a difference between wanting success and never feeling satisfied with what you already had. Over the next year, that difference became more noticeable. Lauren started comparing their life to others. Friends who had larger homes, colleagues with luxury cars, couples posting glamorous vacations on social media. Daniel rarely participated in those comparisons. But Lauren did. and slowly I began to see the tension growing between them. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Small disagreements about spending, comments about future investments, questions about whether Daniel should expand his architecture firm into something bigger. Still, whenever Daniel and I spoke privately, he reassured me. "It's nothing serious, Mom," he said. "Every couple has little disagreements." I wanted to believe him, and maybe part of me did. But another part of me, the part that had spent decades negotiating with CEOs, investors, and people whose smiles didn't always match their intentions, felt something else. A quiet uneasiness, the feeling that beneath the polite conversations and dinner invitations, something inside this marriage wasn't as stable as it appeared. At the time, I told myself I was simply being protective. Daniel had chosen his wife, and I trusted my son. What I didn't know then was that life had already begun moving toward a moment none of us were prepared for, a moment that would take Daniel away from this world far too soon, and reveal a side of Lauren Parker Miller that I had only glimpsed in shadows. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if the signs were always there and I simply chose not to see them. When Daniel married Lauren, I told myself something very important. My job as a mother was no longer to interfere, but to support. Daniel was a grown man with his own life, his own home, and his own marriage. The last thing I wanted was to become the kind of mother-in-law who hovered too closely. So whenever I noticed small things about Lauren that unsettled me, I stayed quiet. For a while, life seemed to settle into a comfortable routine. Daniel's career was growing steadily. His architecture firm had begun winning local recognition for its thoughtful residential designs, and he was especially proud of a community housing project he was helping develop in a suburb outside Boston. Good design should serve people, he told me once during lunch, not just look impressive. That was Daniel in a single sentence. Lauren's career, meanwhile, was also moving forward. She talked often about projects at Reed Financial Consulting and the competition among colleagues for promotions and high-profile clients. At first, I admired her ambition. Ambition, after all, is not something to criticize. It's often the engine that pushes people toward success. But ambition can take different shapes. Daniel worked because he loved creating something meaningful. Lauren worked because she wanted to climb. The difference was subtle, but it became clearer with time. One evening, about a year after their wedding, Daniel invited me over for dinner again. Lauren had cooked, which she didn't do very often, and the house smelled of garlic and roasted vegetables. We sat around the dining table talking about ordinary things, Daniel's latest project, Lauren's office gossip, the unusually warm autumn weather. At one point, Lauren mentioned that a colleague of hers had recently bought a new house. 6 bedrooms, she said, shaking her head in amazement. Can you imagine? And she's only 34. Daniel shrugged as he cut into his chicken. That sounds like a lot of cleaning. Lauren gave him a look. It's called Success, Daniel. He smiled lightly. We already have a perfectly good house. Lauren leaned back in her chair. Yes, but imagine where we could be in 5 years. Her tone wasn't angry. It wasn't even confrontational. But the way she said it felt different, like she was measuring their life against some invisible scoreboard. Daniel didn't respond. He simply continued eating. The conversation moved on, but the atmosphere had shifted slightly. After dinner, while Daniel was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher, Lauren joined me in the living room. She sat down across from me, crossing her legs neatly. "Margaret," she said casually, "you've always seemed very comfortable financially." I smiled politely. "I've been fortunate." She tilted her head slightly. "You must have made some very smart investments over the years." "Some worked out," I said, "some didn't." Lauren nodded thoughtfully. "In my field," she continued, "we always say that the people who succeed long-term are the ones who control assets rather than simply earning salaries." It was an interesting choice of words. Control assets, not earn them. I noticed the way her eyes lingered on the framed photos in the living room. Daniel's graduation picture, a photo of him and me at a beach years ago. Then she looked back at me. "Daniel mentioned you helped them with part of the down payment on the house." "I helped a little," I said. Lauren smiled politely. That was very generous, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Over the next several months, conversations like that happened more often. Lauren didn't ask direct questions about my finances. She was too careful for that. Instead, she asked about market trends, about investment funds, about how large companies structured ownership. Each question sounded professional, but together they formed a pattern. Daniel, of course, never noticed, or if he did, he didn't see anything unusual about it. To him, Lauren was simply talking about the world she worked in. I kept my answers short and vague. There was one thing I had learned after decades in business. Information is power. And the less certain people are about your resources, the more honest their behavior tends to be. Around that time, Lauren's career began accelerating. She received her first major promotion at Reed Financial Consulting. Daniel threw a small celebration dinner for her at their house, inviting a few close friends and colleagues. I attended as well. During that dinner, I watched Lauren interact with her coworkers. She was charming, confident, charismatic, but she was also competitive in a way that reminded me of certain executives I had dealt with over the years, people who measured their worth by how far ahead they were of others. At one point during the evening, one of her colleagues joked about how quickly Lauren had risen within the company. Lauren laughed and said something that stayed with me. Well, you know what they say. In this industry, if you don't move up fast, someone else will take your place. The others laughed. Daniel smiled politely, but something about the comment felt revealing. After the guests left that night, Daniel and I sat together for a few minutes in the quiet living room. Lauren had gone upstairs to take a phone call. "You look tired," I said gently. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Just busy. With work." He hesitated. "Work and everything else." I didn't push. If Daniel wanted to talk, he would. But as he stood up to go upstairs, he paused near the staircase. "Mom," he said softly. "Yes." He looked like he was about to say something important, something heavy. Then he shook his head slightly. "Never mind, it's nothing." I watched him disappear up the stairs. At the time, I assumed he was simply stressed from work. I had no idea that moment would haunt me later, because that might have been the last chance Daniel had to tell me what was really happening in his marriage. And within a year, everything would change. The phone call that shattered my life came on a gray Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee when my phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to a doctor from Boston General Hospital. "Mrs. Miller?" he asked carefully. "Yes. I'm calling about your son Daniel." Something inside my chest tightened immediately. "There's been a medical emergency." Those words are ones no parent ever forgets. My coffee cup slipped from my hand and shattered on the kitchen floor. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely steady. The doctor hesitated for a moment. "Your son suffered a sudden stroke early this morning. He was brought to the hospital by ambulance." My mind struggled to process the information. Daniel was only 38, healthy, active. "How bad is it?" I whispered. There was a long pause. Then the doctor said the words that changed my world forever. "You should come to the hospital as soon as possible." The drive to Boston General Hospital felt longer than any journey I had ever taken in my life. I don't remember much of the road that morning. I remember the gray sky hanging low over the highway, the dull hum of traffic, and the way my hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. Every parent carries a quiet fear somewhere in their heart, the fear that one day something might happen to their child. But that fear always feels distant, unreal, until the phone rings. When I finally reached the hospital, the emergency entrance was crowded with nurses, patients, and families rushing in and out of the sliding glass doors. The world seemed to move normally around me, and that felt almost insulting. How could life continue as usual when my son was lying somewhere inside that building fighting for his life? I hurried to the reception desk. "My son Daniel Miller," I said breathlessly. "They called me this morning." The nurse typed quickly on her computer and then looked up with gentle eyes. "Neurology wing, 4th floor," she said. "Room 417. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a quiet hallway filled with the sterile smell of antiseptic and the soft beeping of medical equipment. Lauren was sitting outside Daniel's room. She looked pale, her hair pulled back loosely, her eyes red, as if she had been crying for hours. For a moment, I felt a rush of sympathy. No matter what doubts I had about her before, this was still the woman my son loved. "Lauren," I said softly. She looked up. "Margaret." Her voice sounded flat, exhausted. "What happened?" I asked. Lauren rubbed her temples. "It was early this morning. Daniel woke up complaining about a terrible headache. Then he collapsed." The words felt unreal. Daniel had always been strong, energetic, the kind of person who seemed too full of life for something like this. "Is he conscious?" I asked. Lauren shook her head slowly. "No." A doctor appeared a few minutes later and guided us into a small consultation room. His expression told me everything before he even spoke. The stroke was severe, he explained carefully. We've done everything we can to stabilize him, but the damage to his brain is extensive. I felt the room tilt slightly. What does that mean? I asked. The doctor hesitated. It means that even if he regains consciousness, his chances of recovering normal brain function are extremely low. The words struck like physical blows. Lauren covered her face and began to sob quietly. I sat there in silence, my mind refusing to accept what I was hearing. My son, my Daniel, was not supposed to disappear like this. Not at 38. Not in a hospital room with machines breathing for him. They allowed us to see him a few minutes later. Daniel lay motionless in the hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and monitors. The steady rhythm of a heart monitor echoed through the room like a metronome, marking time I didn't want to measure. I walked slowly to the bedside. His face looked peaceful, almost as if he were sleeping. But I knew better. "Hi, sweetheart," I whispered, placing my hand gently over his. His skin felt warm. For a moment, I imagined he might open his eyes, that he might smile the way he always did and say something reassuring like, "Hey, Mom, don't worry." But he didn't move. Lauren stood near the foot of the bed, crying quietly. The doctors gave us several hours. Hours that passed like minutes and centuries at the same time. At one point, Daniel's fingers twitched slightly beneath mine. My heart leapt. "Daniel," I whispered. His eyelids fluttered, just for a second, and in that brief moment, I felt his hand tighten weakly around mine. He tried to speak. His lips moved. I leaned closer, desperate to hear him. "Mom?" he whispered faintly. "I'm here," I said quickly. "I'm right here." His breathing became uneven. He struggled to form another word. Then his eyes drifted past me toward Lauren. For a moment, something passed across his face. Something I couldn't fully understand. Fear, confusion, or regret. He tried to speak again, but the sound never came. The machines began to beep faster. Doctors rushed into the room. And just like that, the moment was gone. They worked for several minutes. But deep down, I already knew. When the doctor finally turned toward us, his face carried the quiet finality of someone who had delivered bad news many times before. "I'm very sorry," he said softly. Daniel Miller was gone. The world didn't shatter the way people describe in movies. There was no dramatic collapse. No screaming. Just silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to swallow the entire room. Lauren cried openly. I stood beside the bed, holding Daniel's hand long after the machines had been turned off. Parents are not meant to outlive their children. There is something deeply unnatural about it. Over the next few days, everything moved in a blur. Phone calls, funeral arrangements, friends and family offering condolences. Lauren took charge of many of the practical matters. She contacted Daniel's workplace. She coordinated with the funeral home. She handled paperwork. At first, I appreciated that. Grief had hollowed me out, leaving me moving through the days like a ghost. But slowly I began to notice something strange. Lauren seemed focused, not just grieving, efficient. She spent long hours on the phone discussing documents, accounts, insurance policies. Whenever I asked what she was doing, she gave short answers. Just paperwork, legal things, stuff that needs to be handled. The funeral was held 3 days later. Hundreds of people came. Daniel had touched many lives, colleagues, friends, neighbors, clients. During the service, I watched Lauren from across the room. She cried in all the right moments. She accepted hugs. She thanked people for coming. But every now and then, when she thought no one was watching, her expression changed. For a split second, the sadness vanished, and something colder appeared in its place. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Grief can distort perception, but the uneasy feeling refused to disappear. After the burial, guests slowly drifted away until only a handful of close family members remained. Lauren stood beside Daniel's grave for a while, staring down at the freshly turned earth. Then she turned toward me. "We should head back," she said quietly. Her voice sounded calm, too calm. At the time, I thought the worst moment of my life had already happened. I believed nothing could hurt more than burying my only child. I was wrong, because within 48 hours of that funeral, the woman standing beside me would look me in the eyes and tell me I no longer belonged in my son's home, and that would only be the beginning. The house felt different after Daniel was gone. Grief has a way of changing spaces. Rooms that once held laughter begin to feel hollow, as if the walls themselves remember what has been lost. 2 days after the funeral, I returned to the house Daniel and Lauren shared. The late afternoon light spilled through the tall windows in the living room, illuminating dust that drifted slowly through the air. everything looked the same. The same furniture, the same photographs, the same books Daniel loved. And yet it felt like I had stepped into someone else's life. Lauren was already inside when I arrived. She stood in the kitchen speaking quietly on her phone. When she saw me walk in, she ended the call quickly. "Oh, Margaret," she said. Her tone was polite but distant. "I thought I'd come by and help with some things," I said gently. "Daniel's office upstairs still needs to be sorted through." Lauren nodded slowly. "Yes, I've actually been handling that." Something about the way she said it made me pause. "Handling that already?" I asked. "It needs to be done," she replied. "There are documents, accounts, and other responsibilities." I tried to remind myself that everyone processes grief differently. Some people cry. Some people keep busy. Still, a small knot formed in my stomach. "I was hoping to keep a few of Daniel's things," I said quietly. "Some of his drawings, maybe. And that framed photo from his graduation." Lauren leaned against the kitchen counter, folding her arms. "We'll see," she said. "We'll see." It was a strange answer to such a simple request. Over the next hour, I walked through the house slowly. Daniel's favorite chair still sat beside the living room window. A mug he had used the morning before his stroke was still in the sink. His running shoes rested near the back door. Every object felt like a memory frozen in time. Upstairs, I stepped into Daniel's office. The room smelled faintly of paper and cedar wood. His drafting table stood near the window, covered with rolled architectural plans and pencils scattered across the surface. My chest tightened. I picked up one of the drawings. It was a design for a small community center. He had been working on open spaces, natural light gardens integrated into the building itself. Typical Daniel, always thinking about how to make the world kinder. I carefully rolled the drawing back up. Behind me, Lauren appeared in the doorway. "I've already gone through most of the files," she said. I turned toward her. "Oh, yes. Financial records, personal documents, that sort of thing." Her voice carried a tone of efficiency rather than emotion. I gestured toward the desk. "I'd like to keep some of these." Lauren stepped into the room. "We'll have to review everything first." Her choice of words again. "Review. Not share, not remember. Review." "Lauren," I said gently, "I'm not asking for financial records, just a few personal items." She looked at me for a moment before answering. "I understand that," she said, "but as Daniel's spouse, I'm responsible for managing his estate now." Her words were technically correct. Legally speaking, most of Daniel's assets and decisions now belonged to her. But hearing it spoken so directly so soon after the funeral felt unsettling. "I'm his mother," I replied quietly. Lauren gave a small, polite smile. "Yes, but the legal responsibilities are mine." There was something final in the way she said it. I decided not to argue. Grief can make people defensive. Perhaps she simply felt overwhelmed. So I nodded. "Of course." Over the next 2 days, I visited the house a few more times. Each time, Lauren seemed slightly more distant. She spent long hours on the phone discussing paperwork with lawyers, insurance agents, and financial advisors. Whenever I entered the room during one of these calls, she lowered her voice. Sometimes she ended the conversation abruptly. Once I overheard her say something that made me pause outside the hallway. "Yes, I understand the timeline," she was saying quietly. "The sooner everything is transferred, the easier it will be." Transferred. The word echoed in my mind. When I stepped into the room, she quickly ended the call. "Just legal formalities," she said before I could ask. That uneasy feeling in my chest grew stronger. The following afternoon, I arrived at the house again with a small box. Inside were some of Daniel's childhood photos I had brought from my own home. I thought Lauren might want them. She opened the door when I knocked. But this time, something in her expression had changed completely. The polite mask was gone. Her eyes looked impatient. "Oh," she said, "you're here again." The words were not welcoming. "I just wanted to drop these off," I said, holding up the box. Photos from when Daniel was younger. Lauren glanced at the box briefly. "You can leave them." I stepped inside the hallway. The air felt tense. "Lauren," I said carefully, "I know this has been incredibly difficult for both of us." She didn't respond. "I thought maybe we could sit down later this week," I continued, "and talk about how we can support each other moving forward." For a moment, she simply stared at me. Then she sighed. "Margaret, I think it's better if we establish some boundaries." Boundaries. The word felt cold in that quiet hallway. "What do you mean?" I asked. Lauren crossed her arms. "This house was Daniel and my home. Now it's my responsibility." "I understand that," I said gently. "And I need space to move forward," she continued. The knot in my stomach tightened. I'm not asking to stay here permanently, I said. I just thought we could share memories of Daniel together. Lauren's expression hardened slightly. That may not be healthy. The words hit me harder than I expected. Not healthy. As if grieving my own son beside his widow was somehow inappropriate. Lauren, I began, but she interrupted. I've been thinking about this carefully, she said. Her tone was calm, calculated. And that was when she said the words that would echo in my mind for years. I think it's time for you to move on, Margaret. For a moment, I wasn't sure I had heard correctly. Move on, I repeated quietly. Yes. Lauren looked directly at me. You shouldn't keep coming here. The hallway fell into a heavy silence. I stared at the woman who had been part of my family for 5 years, the woman my son had loved. And for the first time, I saw something clearly in her expression. Not grief, not sadness, something colder, something final. At that moment, I still didn't fully understand what she was planning. But within the next few minutes, she would make her intentions painfully clear. For a few seconds after Lauren told me I shouldn't come back to the house, I simply stood there trying to understand what she meant. The hallway was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, a car drove past its tires, humming against the pavement, as if the world had no idea that something inside that house had just shifted. Lauren, I said slowly, this was Daniel's home. Yes, she replied calmly, and Daniel is gone. Her words landed with a kind of blunt finality that made my chest tighten. I'm his mother, I said quietly. She didn't argue with that. Instead, she took a step closer to the front door and rested her hand lightly on the handle. And I'm his wife, she replied. There was something in her tone now that I had never heard before. Authority, ownership. I need to start organizing things, she continued. The house, the paperwork, the future. I'm not stopping you, I said. I only came to spend time here. To remember him. Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. I think that's exactly the problem. For a moment, I didn't understand what she meant. What problem, I asked. She sighed as if explaining something obvious to someone who simply refused to see it. You coming here all the time keeps everything stuck in grief. I stared at her. My son died 4 days ago. I know that, she said quickly, but we can't stay frozen forever. Her words sounded rehearsed, measured, almost as if she had already gone over this conversation in her head several times before I arrived. I looked around the living room behind her, the photographs on the walls, the familiar furniture, the staircase Daniel had walked down countless times. Every corner of that house held memories of my son. And suddenly I realized something that made the air feel colder. Lauren was already thinking about life after Daniel, far sooner than I had imagined possible. I'm not asking to live here, I said carefully. I just hoped we could support each other. Lauren shook her head slowly. I think it's healthier if we move forward separately. Separately. The word felt like a door closing. Lauren, I said softly, we're family. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Then it vanished. Daniel was the connection, she said. And just like that, the truth settled between us. Without Daniel, she no longer saw me as family. I opened the small box I had brought with me and held up one of the photographs inside. It was an old picture of Daniel when he was 8 years old, grinning widely while holding a homemade birdhouse we had built together. I thought you might want these, I said. Lauren glanced at the photo briefly. You can keep them. Her voice carried no emotion. They're from his childhood, I said. Yes. And you don't want them? She shrugged slightly. I have my own memories. Something inside my chest tightened again. I carefully placed the photograph back into the box. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Lauren cleared her throat. Margaret, there's something else we need to discuss. I looked at her. What is it? Her gaze shifted toward the staircase, then back to me. I think it would be best if you didn't return here anymore. The words echoed heavily in the quiet hallway. I felt as if the ground beneath my feet had shifted slightly. You're asking me not to visit my son's home, I asked. It's not your home, she replied calmly. The sentence was delivered so plainly that it took a second for the meaning to fully sink in. This house belonged to Daniel and me, Lauren continued, and now it belongs to me. The way she emphasized the last 2 words left no room for misunderstanding. To me, I'm not trying to take anything from you, I said gently. I only wanted a few of Daniel's things. His drawings, maybe some of his books. Lauren folded her arms. I'll decide what happens to Daniel's belongings. The knot in my stomach tightened further. You'll decide, I repeated quietly. Yes. Her voice was steady, controlled. I'm responsible for his estate now. Legally, she was right. But hearing her speak about Daniel's life like a list of assets made something inside me ache in a way I couldn't fully describe. "Lauren," I said carefully, "those are memories of my son." "And Daniel was my husband," she replied. Her tone was not cruel. It was simply cold, efficient, like someone closing a business transaction. Then she glanced down at the small suitcase I had brought with me earlier in the week, one I had temporarily left in the hallway after helping with funeral arrangements. "I actually packed the rest of your things," she said. "My things?" "Yes." She opened the closet beside the front door and pulled out the suitcase. For a moment, I thought she was simply returning it to me. Then she walked to the front door and opened it. The late afternoon air drifted inside. Lauren set the suitcase on the porch. The sound of the wheels touching the wooden boards echoed louder than it should have. "What are you doing?" I asked. She looked at me calmly. "I think it's better if you go home, Margaret." The words hung in the air between us. "You're asking me to leave." "I'm telling you it's time." For several seconds, I couldn't move. I looked past her into the living room, the place where Daniel and I had shared so many quiet conversations over the years. And suddenly I understood something painful. Lauren had already decided this long before today. This wasn't a moment of grief. It was a plan. "You're really doing this?" I asked softly. Lauren met my gaze without hesitation. "Yes." There was no anger in her expression. No guilt. Only certainty. I walked slowly toward the door. When I stepped onto the porch, the cool air brushed against my face. Lauren followed behind me. The suitcase sat beside the steps. I turned back toward her. For a brief moment, I hoped I might see some trace of the woman Daniel had loved, some hesitation, some regret. But there was nothing. Just that same calm expression. "Goodbye, Margaret," she said. And then she closed the door. The sound of the lock clicking echoed in the quiet street. I stood there for a long time. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. The same windows. The same white porch railing. But everything had changed. My son was gone. And the woman he had married had just erased me from his life, as if I'd never belonged there. A few neighbors passed by on the sidewalk offering sympathetic nods, unaware of what had just happened behind that closed door. Finally, I picked up my suitcase. My hands were steady now, not because the pain had disappeared, but because something else had begun to rise quietly beneath it. Clarity. Lauren Parker believed she had removed the last obstacle standing between her and whatever future she was planning. She believed I was simply an old woman who no longer had any place in her life. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that every morning she walked into her office at Reed Financial Consulting. She was walking into a company that belonged to me, and sooner or later, the truth would reach her. That night, I didn't drive home immediately. Instead, I sat in my car parked across the street from Daniel's house for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the front door that had just closed on me. The porch light flickered on as dusk settled over the neighborhood. Through the living room window, I could see Lauren moving around inside her silhouette, passing briefly through the warm glow of the lamps. Life inside that house was already continuing. Without Daniel, and without me, the realization settled heavily in my chest. For the first few minutes, grief threatened to swallow me again. The kind of grief that makes it difficult to breathe, the kind that reminds you that the person who once called you mom will never walk through another door again. But beneath that grief, another emotion slowly began to take shape. Not anger, not revenge, something calmer, something clearer. I had spent 40 years navigating the business world. I had negotiated with people who smiled warmly while planning to take advantage of every weakness they could find. And I had learned one thing above all else. When someone shows you exactly who they are, believe them. Lauren had shown me who she was. The woman who had politely asked about my investments over dinner. The woman who had spoken passionately about ambition and success. The woman who had already begun organizing Daniel's estate just hours after his death. And the woman who had calmly placed my suitcase on the porch. They were all the same person. The only difference now was that the mask had slipped. I finally started the car and drove away. My own home in Connecticut was quiet when I arrived. The house felt larger than usual, emptier, as if Daniel's absence had somehow followed me back there. I set my suitcase near the door and walked slowly into the kitchen. The clock on the wall read 8:17 p.m. For the first time in days, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down at the table. Grief was still there, heavy and constant. But my mind had begun to move again. I reached for my phone. There was one person I trusted to help me understand what had happened. Robert Hayes. Robert had been my attorney for more than 25 years. He was also one of the few people who knew the full structure of Miller Holdings and the various companies connected to it. When he answered, his voice was calm as always. "Margaret," he said, "I was going to call you tomorrow. How are you holding up?" "Not very well," I admitted. There was a pause. "I'm sorry about Daniel," he said quietly. "Thank you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I took a slow breath. "Robert, I need you to check something for me." "Of course." "I want a full review of Daniel's estate, insurance policies, accounts, property titles, everything." Robert didn't ask why. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. "All right," he said. "I'll begin pulling the documents in the morning." There's something else, I added. "Yes. I want to know what Lauren has already filed or transferred since Daniel's death." This time, Robert hesitated slightly. "That might take a few days," he said, "but it can be done." "I'd appreciate it." When we ended the call, I sat quietly for a long time. The house around me was silent. In the living room, an old photograph of Daniel sat on the bookshelf. He was about 12 years old in the picture, holding a soccer ball and smiling with the easy confidence of a child who believed the world was safe. I walked over and picked up the frame. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I didn't know exactly what I was apologizing for. Maybe for not seeing the cracks in his marriage sooner. Maybe for not asking more questions the night he almost told me something. Or maybe for the fact that I was already thinking about the practical realities of what Lauren was doing. The next morning, I woke early. Years of business had trained my body to wake before sunrise, and grief hadn't changed that habit. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. There were several emails waiting for me from my executive team. Normally, I would have ignored them during a personal crisis like this, but today something told me to open them. One message in particular caught my attention. It came from the Chief Operations Officer of one of our consulting subsidiaries, Reed Financial Consulting. The subject line read, ***, quarterly performance update. ***. I opened the email and skimmed through the report. Financial metrics, client growth, department performance. Then I noticed something. A section listing several employees being considered for promotion. One of the names made me pause. Lauren Parker Miller. I stared at the screen for a moment. It had never occurred to me before how strange that connection was. Lauren had worked at Reed Financial Consulting for almost 4 years now, and Reed Financial Consulting, through a series of acquisitions and investment structures, ultimately belonged to Miller Holdings, which meant that, technically speaking, Lauren worked for me. Of course, she had no idea. Miller Holdings operated quietly. Most employees in our subsidiaries had no direct awareness of the ownership structure above them. Still, the coincidence struck me differently now. The woman who had just thrown me out of my son's house walked into a building every morning that existed because of decisions I had made years earlier. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time since Daniel's death, my mind began connecting pieces. Lauren had been extremely focused on Daniel's estate. She had rushed through legal paperwork. She had insisted on controlling his belongings. And she had been remarkably quick to remove me from the picture. Why? If grief had been the only factor, her behavior might have been harsh but understandable. But something about the speed of her actions suggested something else. Planning. Calculation. I opened another file from the company report and scanned through the employee details. Lauren's department performance reviews. Her supervisor's comments. There were notes about her ambition, her drive, her ability to navigate office politics. One line in particular caught my eye. Lauren demonstrates strong strategic instincts and understands how to position herself effectively within company dynamics. I couldn't help but notice the irony. Yes, she certainly knew how to position herself, but perhaps she didn't realize the full board she was playing on. Later that afternoon, Robert called back. "I've started reviewing the initial documents," he said. And there are several insurance policies connected to Daniel's name, Robert explained. Most of them list Lauren as the primary beneficiary. That wasn't surprising. "What about recent filings?" I asked. "There were several legal requests submitted very quickly," Robert continued. "Property transfers, account consolidations, and estate declarations." "How quickly?" Robert paused. "Within 24 hours of Daniel's death." The number sent a chill through me. 24 hours. Even the most efficient legal teams rarely move that fast without preparation. "Robert," I said slowly, "is it possible some of those documents were prepared before Daniel died?" There was silence on the other end of the phone. "It's possible," he said carefully, "but we'd need to examine the filing dates and signatures more closely." I stared out the kitchen window at the quiet trees outside. For the first time, a question formed in my mind that I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. What if Lauren had been preparing for Daniel's death before it happened? I didn't have an answer yet, but one thing had become very clear. The story of what happened to my son and what Lauren was doing now was far from finished, and if she believed throwing me out of that house had ended my role in her life, she was about to learn how wrong she was. The possibility that Lauren had been preparing paperwork before Daniel's death stayed with me long after I ended the call with Robert. I didn't jump to conclusions immediately. Years of experience had taught me something important. Suspicions are not evidence. Acting too quickly without facts often causes more damage than patients ever will. Still, the timeline Robert described bothered me. 24 hours. That was incredibly fast. Even when people are organized, the chaos surrounding a sudden death usually slows everything down. There are hospital calls, family notifications, funeral arrangements, and emotional shock. But Lauren had somehow found time to begin transferring assets almost immediately. That meant one of two things. Either she had extraordinary focus during grief, or some of those documents had already been prepared. I spent the rest of that morning reviewing more information about Reed Financial Consulting. Normally, I left the daily management of our subsidiaries to their executive teams. Miller Holdings operated quietly behind the scenes, allowing individual companies to maintain their own leadership structures and identities. But ownership always left a paper trail. Within a few minutes, I pulled up the internal leadership structure of Reed Financial Consulting. The company's managing director was Thomas Reed. I knew Thomas well. He had helped build the firm years before we acquired majority ownership through one of our investment funds. Since then, he had remained in charge of day-to-day operations. Thomas was competent, cautious, and most importantly, loyal. If anyone inside that company could provide a clear picture of Lauren's professional behavior, it would be him. I considered calling him immediately. But something held me back. If Lauren was capable of planning financial moves so quickly after Daniel's death, then she was also capable of monitoring conversations around her. For now, it was better to observe quietly. That afternoon, my phone rang again. It was Emily Carter, Daniel's closest friend from his architecture firm. "Margaret," Emily said softly when I answered. "How are you holding up?" Her voice carried genuine concern. Emily had known Daniel for nearly 10 years. They had worked together on several projects and had grown close through countless late nights designing buildings and solving architectural problems. "I'm managing," I said gently. "How are you?" "Honestly," Emily sighed, "it still doesn't feel real." "I know." There was a pause. "I keep expecting Daniel to walk into the office with coffee like he always did," she said. I closed my eyes for a moment. Daniel had loved that routine. Every morning, he stopped at the same cafe near his office and bought coffee for half the team. "It's strange how habits stay in places long after people leave," Emily continued quietly. We spoke for a few minutes about Daniel's work, his last project, the unfinished plans he had been developing, and the impact he had left on the firm. Then Emily hesitated. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did Daniel ever mention any problems at home recently?" The question caught me slightly off guard. "Why do you ask?" Emily took a slow breath. "A few weeks before, everything happened. Daniel seemed distracted." "In what way?" "He was quieter than usual," she said. "One night, we stayed late at the office reviewing plans for a project. Everyone else had gone home. I listened carefully," Emily continued. "He asked me something strange." "What did he ask?" "He asked if I knew any good estate lawyers." For a moment, I didn't speak. "Estate lawyers." "Did he say why I asked?" Emily shook her head, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "He said it was just something he was looking into. I didn't think much of it at the time. But now I asked. Now it feels different." A chill ran slowly down my spine. Daniel had been researching estate lawyers, and he had done it weeks before his death. "Did he mention Lauren?" I asked carefully. Emily hesitated again. "Not directly. But he said something like, 'Sometimes you don't realize what someone wants until you look at things from a distance.'" The words felt heavy. "Do you remember exactly when that conversation happened?" I asked. Emily thought for a moment. "About 3 weeks before he died." 3 weeks. I thanked Emily for telling me and promised we would talk again soon. After the call ended, I sat silently at the kitchen table. The picture forming in my mind was becoming more complicated. Daniel had been researching estate lawyers. Lauren had been unusually efficient in transferring assets. and she had been quick to remove me from Daniel's life after his death. None of these facts proved wrongdoing, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. That evening, Robert called again. I found something else, he said. What is it? One of the insurance policies Daniel held had recently been updated. When? About a month ago. My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. What kind of update? The beneficiary structure remained the same, Lauren as primary beneficiary, but the policy amount was increased significantly. Increased, I repeated. Yes. By how much? Robert paused. Almost double. The number hung in the air between us. That's unusual, I said slowly. It can happen, Robert replied, but increases of that size usually involve detailed financial planning. Did Daniel handle it personally? That's the interesting part, Robert said. The documentation indicates that both Daniel and Lauren signed the update. For a moment, I said nothing. Margaret, Robert added carefully, I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate, but given the timing, it's worth examining more closely. Yes, I said quietly. It is. After we ended the call, I walked into the living room again. The evening light had begun to fade, leaving the room dim and quiet. Daniel's photograph still sat on the bookshelf. I picked it up once more. Were you trying to tell me something? I whispered. In the picture, Daniel's younger self smiled back at me with that familiar warmth. But now I remembered something else from the hospital. The moment just before he lost consciousness. The way his eyes had shifted toward Lauren. The expression on his face. At the time, I had interpreted it as confusion or fear, but now another possibility crept into my mind. What if Daniel had been trying to warn me? I placed the photograph back on the shelf. Then I returned to the kitchen and opened my laptop again. This time I didn't open company reports. Instead, I opened the internal directory for Reed Financial Consulting. I searched for Lauren Parker Miller. Her profile appeared instantly. Senior Financial Consultant, promotion under consideration, Department Strategic Advisory. I studied the information for a long moment. Lauren believed she had closed the door on me when she locked Daniel's house behind her. She believed she had removed the only person who might question her decisions. But what she didn't realize was that every morning she still walked into a building connected to my world, a building whose leadership ultimately answered to me. I didn't know yet what role that connection would play, but something told me it would matter. Because if Lauren Parker Miller had truly believed she had erased me from her life, she had made a very serious mistake. The next few days passed in a strange combination of silence and discovery. Grief still came in waves. There were moments when I found myself standing in the kitchen holding Daniel's favorite mug, suddenly unable to remember why I had walked into the room in the first place. Other times, memories arrived without warning, a laugh, a childhood moment, the sound of his voice saying "Mom" in that easy, familiar way. But beneath that grief, my mind had begun to work again. And once it started, it didn't stop. 2 days after my conversation with Emily Carter, I decided it was time to speak directly with Thomas Reed. I didn't want to accuse anyone of anything, not yet. But I needed to understand how Lauren behaved in the one place where her guard might occasionally slip work. Thomas answered my call quickly. "Margaret," he said warmly, "I was very sorry to hear about Daniel. I meant to reach out sooner." "Thank you, Thomas," I replied. Daniel had met Thomas once or twice during industry events. They had gotten along well, mostly because Daniel appreciated straightforward people, and Thomas was exactly that. "How can I help?" Thomas asked. "I wanted to ask you about someone who works at Reed Financial," I said. "Of course. Lauren Parker Miller." There was a brief pause on the line. "Yes," Thomas said slowly. "Lauren works in our Strategic Advisory division. What can you tell me about her?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. "She's capable," he said carefully. "Ambitious, very driven." "Driven in a good way?" I asked. He hesitated again. "That depends on what you value." I leaned back in my chair. "What does that mean?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Lauren understands how to position herself well inside the company." "Position herself?" "She's very aware of internal politics," he explained. "She builds relationships with the right people." "And her work performance?" "Solid," Thomas admitted. "Not exceptional, but competent." That answer caught my attention. "Not exceptional." "No," Thomas said, honestly. "She's efficient and confident, which helps her stand out. But from a technical standpoint, there are stronger analysts in her department." "In other words," I said, "she's good at visibility." Thomas laughed softly. "That's one way to put it." We spoke for a few more minutes about the company's current projects and overall performance. Then I asked the question that had been lingering in my mind. Has Lauren mentioned anything about her personal life recently? Thomas paused. Not in detail. But, well, after Daniel passed away, she informed HR that she would be taking a short bereavement leave. But she also asked about the timeline for an upcoming promotion review. How soon after his death, I asked quietly. 2 days. 2 days. I felt the same cold sensation return that had appeared during my conversation with Robert. Thomas continued. She said she wanted to make sure the leave wouldn't affect her evaluation. And what did you tell her? That the company would handle the situation appropriately, he said. Of course. I thanked Thomas for the information and ended the call. For a long moment, I simply sat there. Lauren had contacted her workplace about a promotion review just 2 days after Daniel died. Perhaps that didn't prove anything on its own. People process grief differently. Some people throw themselves into work to avoid facing emotional pain. But combined with everything else I had learned, the pattern was becoming clearer. Lauren moved quickly. She acted strategically, and she rarely allowed emotions to slow her down. Later that afternoon, Robert called again. I finished reviewing several of the estate documents, he said. And there's nothing illegal so far, Robert explained. Lauren is acting within her rights as Daniel's spouse. That doesn't surprise me. But there is something interesting. I waited. Daniel had scheduled an appointment with a different estate lawyer 2 weeks before he died. A different lawyer. Yes. Did he attend the meeting? No, Robert said. The appointment was canceled the day before. Who canceled it? The records indicate Daniel did. The information made my mind spin slightly. Daniel had planned to speak with another estate lawyer, then canceled the appointment. Why? Robert, I said slowly. Is there any indication of what he intended to change? Not specifically, Robert replied. But most people don't schedule estate consultations without a reason. No, I agreed. They don't. When we ended the call, I stood up and walked to the window. The autumn air outside had turned colder. Leaves moved across the lawn in slow circles as the wind shifted through the trees. Daniel should have been there somewhere. Working, laughing, living. Instead, I was standing alone, piecing together fragments of information about the final weeks of his life. I thought again about the hospital. About the moment Daniel had briefly opened his eyes. The way he had looked toward Lauren. At the time, I believed he had simply been confused. But what if that expression had meant something else? What if Daniel had already begun to realize something about his marriage? The thought made my chest tighten. I walked back to the kitchen and opened my laptop once more. This time, I accessed a secure internal portal used only by senior leadership at Miller Holdings. Within minutes, I located the organizational oversight reports connected to Reed Financial Consulting. Lauren Parker Miller's name appeared again. Her promotion review was scheduled for the following month. I studied the report carefully. Her supervisor's evaluation described her as strategically minded and highly motivated. But there were also smaller notes. Mentions of internal competition. Comments about her ability to influence perceptions among leadership. Nothing that violated company policy, but enough to suggest that Lauren understood how to manipulate appearances. As I closed the report, one final thought occurred to me. Lauren believed her world had moved forward. She believed she had secured Daniel's assets. She believed she had removed me from the picture. But what she didn't realize was that every step she took from now on would still occur inside systems connected to my decisions. Inside a company structure I had built, and inside a network of people who trusted my judgment more than they trusted office politics. I wasn't interested in revenge. That wasn't the point. What I wanted was something simpler. The truth. About Daniel's final weeks. About the decisions Lauren had made. And about the life my son had been living before everything suddenly ended. Because the more I learned, the more certain I became of one thing. Daniel had been trying to change something before he died. And whatever that something was, Lauren Parker Miller had made sure it never happened. The more I learned about Daniel's final weeks, the more one uncomfortable truth began to settle in my mind. My son had been planning something. The canceled meeting with the estate lawyer, the increased insurance policy, the way he had looked at Lauren in the hospital room. None of these pieces formed a clear picture yet, but they did form a pattern. And patterns in my experience rarely appear by accident. 3 days after my call with Thomas Reed, I decided it was time to leave Connecticut for a while. Not because I wanted to confront Lauren directly, but because I needed to see things for myself. Boston was only a few hours away, and Daniel's world, his office, his projects, His unfinished plans was still there. If he had been trying to change something in his life, traces of that decision might still exist somewhere. I drove into the city early on a Thursday morning. Boston looked the same as it always had: busy sidewalks, narrow streets full of old brick buildings, coffee shops opening their doors to the morning rush. But to me, the city felt different now. Daniel was no longer part of it. His architecture firm occupied the third floor of a renovated warehouse near the harbor. The building had tall windows and exposed wooden beams, the kind of place Daniel had always loved. When I stepped inside, Emily Carter was the first person to notice me. "Margaret," she said softly, walking over quickly. We hugged for a moment. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said. "I hope that's all right." "Of course it is." Emily guided me into Daniel's office. The room looked almost exactly the way it had the last time I visited. His drafting table still stood by the window. Blueprints were stacked neatly in one corner. A small plant he had been trying unsuccessfully to keep alive sat near the bookshelf. Seeing the room untouched made my chest tighten. "He was working late the night before the stroke," Emily said quietly. "On which project?" She pointed toward a set of large rolled plans on the desk. "The community center design." I walked closer and carefully unrolled one of the drawings. The design was beautiful open spaces, gardens built into the structure, sunlight flowing through wide windows. Daniel had always believed architecture should bring people together. "He loved this project," Emily said. "I can tell." For a few minutes, we stood there in silence. Then Emily hesitated. "Margaret, there's something else I found after Daniel passed away." My heart tightened slightly. "What is it?" Emily opened one of the desk drawers and pulled out a small notebook. "I wasn't sure if it was important," she said, handing it to me. "But Daniel had been writing things down in here." I opened the notebook slowly. Most of the pages contained sketches, building layouts, design ideas, quick calculations. But near the back of the notebook, the tone changed. The writing became more personal. Short notes, reminders, questions. One page caught my attention immediately. Asterisk review insurance update. Another line beneath it read, asterisk call lawyer again. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the page. There, written in Daniel's familiar handwriting, was a sentence that made my stomach drop. Asterisk need to reconsider everything before it's too late. Too late. "What do you think he meant by that?" Emily asked quietly. "I'm not sure," I said. But deep down I had a growing suspicion. Daniel had been preparing to change something significant in his life. Possibly his finances, possibly his estate, possibly something connected to Lauren. I closed the notebook carefully. "Thank you for giving this to me," I said. "Of course." Emily hesitated again. "There's one more thing," she added. "Yes." The night we stayed late at the office, the night he mentioned the estate lawyer, Daniel also said something else. What was it? Emily looked slightly uncomfortable. "He said sometimes you don't really see someone clearly until money gets involved." The words echoed heavily in my mind. Money. That had always been the one subject Lauren seemed particularly interested in. "When did he say that?" I asked. Emily thought for a moment. "About 3 weeks before everything happened." The same timeline again. 3 weeks. Daniel had been researching estate lawyers, writing notes about insurance changes, questioning things in his notebook. And then suddenly he had suffered a fatal stroke. I forced myself to take a slow breath. There was still no proof that any of these events were connected. But I could no longer ignore the possibility that Daniel had begun to suspect something in his marriage. "Emily," I said gently, "did Daniel ever seem afraid?" She shook her head slowly. "No, not afraid. Concerned. Maybe." She looked toward the window. But Daniel wasn't the kind of person who jumped to conclusions. If something bothered him, he usually tried to fix it quietly. That sounded exactly like my son. I placed the notebook carefully inside my bag. "I think he was trying to fix something," I said. Emily nodded. "I think so too." When I left the office later that afternoon, the air outside had turned cold. The harbor wind carried the smell of salt and the distant sound of boats moving across the water. I walked slowly down the street, thinking about everything I had learned. Daniel had been preparing to change something, but whatever decision he had been building toward, he never had the chance to complete it. And now Lauren controlled everything he had left behind. His house, his accounts, his estate. She probably believed the story was over, but she was wrong. Because every new piece of information I uncovered brought me closer to understanding what Daniel had been trying to do. And the closer I came to the truth, The more certain I became that Lauren Parker Miller had never expected anyone to look this closely. The notebook Daniel left behind stayed with me like a quiet weight in my bag as I walked back to my car that afternoon. I didn't open it again immediately. Part of me already knew what it represented. It wasn't proof of anything illegal. It wasn't even a direct accusation, but it was something perhaps more important. It was evidence that Daniel had been thinking, questioning, reconsidering. And that meant the life he was living before his death might not have been as simple as it looked from the outside. The drive back to Connecticut gave me time to think. For the first time since Daniel died, my thoughts weren't just about grief. They were about understanding. Daniel had planned to speak to an estate lawyer. He had updated his insurance policy. He had written notes suggesting he needed to reconsider everything. And then he died suddenly. Was it all coincidence? Possibly. But experience had taught me that when multiple events align in a pattern, ignoring them rarely leads to the truth. That evening, I called Robert again. "I may have something you should see," I told him. "What is it?" he asked. "A notebook Daniel kept at his office. Personal notes." "Yes." I described the pages I had found. The insurance reminder. The lawyer note. The line about reconsidering everything. Robert was silent for a moment. "That's interesting," he finally said. "Why?" "Because it suggests Daniel was actively planning changes to his estate." "That's what I thought." "Do you know what kind of lawyer he intended to meet?" "I believe it was an estate specialist." Robert exhaled slowly. If Daniel had completed those changes, the structure of his assets could have been very different. Different how? Well, Robert said carefully he might have changed beneficiaries, created a trust, or redirected certain assets. In other words, Robert said Lauren might not have inherited everything the way she expects. The thought lingered in my mind. If Daniel had been preparing to modify his estate, then his sudden death had frozen everything exactly as it was. Exactly in Lauren's favor. I closed my eyes briefly. "I need to understand what Daniel was planning," I said quietly. "And we will," Robert assured me. But before we ended the call, another idea occurred to me. "Robert," I said. "Yes." "Do you know when Lauren is returning to work?" He paused. "Why do you ask?" "I'd like to observe something." The following Monday morning, I found myself standing inside the lobby of Reed Financial Consulting. The building was located in a sleek glass tower in downtown Boston. Employees moved quickly through the entrance carrying laptops and coffee cups, speaking into phones as they hurried toward elevators. To them, this was just another workday. To me, it was something else entirely. This company had been part of Miller Holdings' portfolio for years. I had visited the office many times before, though rarely without advance notice. Today was different. Today, I wasn't here for a scheduled meeting. I was here because Lauren Parker Miller was returning from bereavement leave, and I wanted to see her reaction when the reality of our connection finally became clear. Thomas Reed met me in the lobby a few minutes later. He looked slightly surprised, but quickly recovered. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I didn't expect you in person. I thought it might be time for a visit." He nodded. "Of course." We stepped into the elevator together. "I assume this visit is related to Lauren," Thomas said carefully. "In part." He didn't ask more questions? Thomas understood discretion. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, he guided me into a conference room overlooking the city skyline. The glass walls allowed a clear view of the main office area outside. "Her department is down there," Thomas said, pointing through the window. From where I stood, I could see rows of desks, computer screens glowing softly under the office lights. Employees moved between workstations, talking quietly. Then the elevator doors opened again at the far end of the floor. Lauren stepped out. Even from a distance, I recognized her immediately. She wore a dark blazer and carried a leather portfolio under her arm. Her posture was confident, her expression composed. No one looking at her would have guessed she had lost her husband only 2 weeks earlier. Several colleagues greeted her warmly. Lauren accepted their sympathy with the same carefully measured sadness I had seen at Daniel's funeral. She shook hands. She nodded politely. And then she walked toward her desk. I watched her for a long moment. "This is her first day back?" I asked Thomas. "Yes." "Has she been informed about the promotion review yet?" "Not officially." I nodded slowly. Lauren sat down at her desk and began reviewing something on her computer screen. From this distance, she looked completely at ease, as if her world had settled back into its normal rhythm, as if the chapter involving Daniel and me had already been closed. I turned to Thomas. "I'd like you to schedule a meeting," I said. "With Lauren?" "Yes." Thomas raised an eyebrow slightly. What should the meeting be about? Performance review, I replied calmly. And who will attend? You, I said. And me. Thomas understood immediately. He nodded once. I'll arrange it. Across the office floor, Lauren continued working at her desk. She had no idea that the quiet older woman she had locked out of Daniel's house was standing only a few rooms away. She had no idea that the structure of the company she worked for ultimately traced back to decisions I had made decades earlier. And she certainly had no idea that within the next hour, she would walk into a conference room and come face to face with the one person she thought she had removed from her life. For the first time since Daniel's death, I felt something other than grief. Not anger, not revenge. Something simpler, clarity. Because Lauren Parker Miller had believed she could erase me with the click of a door lock. But the truth was about to walk straight into her workplace, and there would be no door for her to close this time. The conference room was quiet except for the soft hum of the building's air system. Through the glass wall, I could see the office floor outside. Employees typing, walking between desks, speaking quietly into phones. It was the ordinary rhythm of a normal workday. Lauren Parker Miller was still at her desk. From where I sat, I could see her profile as she spoke with a colleague, occasionally glancing at her computer screen. Her posture remained confident, her expression controlled. If she felt grief, she hid it well. Thomas Reed stood beside the window, checking his watch. She'll be here in a few minutes, he said. Thank you, I replied. He had sent Lauren a simple message through the internal system requesting a meeting with senior leadership regarding departmental evaluations. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Lauren had likely assumed this meeting would concern her upcoming promotion review. A few minutes later, the door opened. Lauren stepped inside. She entered with the same composed professionalism she always displayed in public settings. Good morning, Thomas, she said as she walked in. Then her eyes shifted toward me, and everything stopped. For a moment, Lauren didn't move. The color drained slightly from her face as recognition settled in. Margaret, she said quietly. The surprise in her voice was unmistakable. Thomas closed the door behind her. Lauren looked from him back to me. I didn't realize you were visiting the office today. Her tone had changed instantly. Gone was the cold certainty she had shown when she placed my suitcase on the porch. Now her voice carried hesitation, uncertainty. I remained seated. Good morning, Lauren. She slowly pulled out the chair across from us and sat down. What is this meeting about? She asked. Thomas spoke first. We're reviewing several personnel matters within the advisory division. Lauren nodded slightly. That makes sense. But her eyes kept returning to me. She clearly hadn't expected to see me there. Not in that room. Not in that building. I folded my hands calmly on the table. Lauren, I said. Yes. I believe the last time we spoke was at Daniel's house. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. Yes. You asked me not to return. She swallowed. That was a difficult situation. Was it? Lauren hesitated. I thought it was best for everyone to have space after the funeral. Her explanation sounded carefully constructed, professional, polite. But beneath the words, I could see the unease growing in her expression. She still didn't understand why I was there. Not yet. Thomas glanced at me briefly. I gave him a small nod. He turned back to Lauren. Lauren, he said calmly, there's something about the company structure that you may not be aware of. Lauren looked confused. What do you mean? Thomas gestured toward me. Reed Financial Consulting is part of a larger investment group. Yes, Lauren said, I know that. But you may not know who ultimately owns that group. Lauren's eyes flickered toward me again. For a brief moment, the room fell completely silent. Then I spoke. Miller Holdings, I said quietly. Lauren frowned slightly. I've heard of it. Yes, I replied. It's the parent company behind Reed Financial Consulting. Her gaze sharpened. And Miller Holdings belongs to me. The words settled into the room like a weight. Lauren blinked once, then twice. For several seconds, she said nothing. It was as if her mind needed time to rearrange the information. You're saying, she began slowly. Yes, I said. The company where you work is part of the organization I built. Lauren leaned back slightly in her chair. Her expression shifted rapidly, surprised disbelief calculation. You own the company, she asked. I own the majority controlling interest, I replied. The silence returned. Outside the glass wall, employees continued working, unaware of the conversation unfolding inside. Lauren's eyes moved slowly between Thomas and me. So, this meeting is part of an internal review, Thomas said. Her posture changed subtly. She sat straighter, her professional instincts immediately taking over. Well, she said I assume this relates to my performance evaluation. In part, I replied. Lauren forced a small smile. My department has been performing very well this quarter. I'm aware. And I believe Thomas has already reviewed my promotion file. Thomas remained calm. Yes, he said. Lauren looked relieved. Then I'm sure everything is in order. Her confidence had begun returning, but she was still watching me carefully. I leaned forward slightly. There are a few additional matters we'd like to discuss. Lauren folded her hands together, such as your conduct within the company. Her expression hardened slightly. My conduct? Yes. Thomas opened a folder on the table. Several reports have been submitted regarding internal interactions within your department. Lauren frowned. What kind of reports? Concerns about workplace behavior, he said. Her eyes narrowed. I'm not aware of any formal complaints. There haven't been formal complaints, Thomas clarified. But there have been observations. Lauren's voice became sharper. Observations from whom? Colleagues, he said calmly. Lauren glanced toward me again. And Margaret is involved in this. Why? I met her gaze evenly. Because leadership decisions in this company ultimately involve me. Her jaw tightened slightly. For a moment, it seemed as if she might say something impulsive. But Lauren had always been good at controlling her reactions. She took a slow breath. Then I'd appreciate understanding the specific concerns, she said. Thomas slid a document across the table. Lauren picked it up and began reading. As she scanned the page, the confidence in her posture slowly faded. The document contained several summaries, internal statements, examples of workplace behavior, descriptions of how she had used personal narratives to influence professional perception, comments about conversations where she had spoken negatively about family members, including me. Lauren finished reading the first page and set the paper down slowly. These are opinions, she said. They're observations, Thomas corrected. She looked at me again. So this is about personal matters? No, I said calmly. This is about integrity. Lauren's eyes flashed. You're using your position to retaliate. I shook my head. No, Lauren. My voice remained steady. I'm using my position to ask questions. The room grew quiet again. Lauren stared at me across the table. For the first time since the meeting began, the confident professional mask she wore began to crack. You shouldn't even be involved in this, she said. I'm involved because this company exists within my responsibility, I replied. And because the decisions you've made recently extend beyond your desk. Lauren's breathing grew slightly heavier. What does that mean? It means, I said quietly, that the story you thought ended when you locked me out of Daniel's house. I paused. It's only beginning. For the first time, Lauren Parker Miller looked uncertain, and she was starting to realize something she had never considered before. The woman she had dismissed as an inconvenience had far more influence over her future than she had ever imagined. For a few seconds after I finished speaking, Lauren didn't respond. She sat perfectly still in her chair, the document still resting in front of her on the table. Through the glass wall of the conference room, the rest of the office continued moving as if nothing unusual was happening. Phones rang. Wowerty! Keyboards clicked. Employees walked past carrying folders and coffee cups. But inside that room, the air had grown noticeably heavier. Lauren finally looked up. This is ridiculous, she said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried an edge now. You're bringing me into a performance review because you're angry about what happened at my house. Thomas spoke before I could respond. This meeting was scheduled to address internal concerns, he said calmly. Personal matters are not the focus here. Lauren let out a quiet laugh. Come on, Thomas, we both know that's not true. Her eyes shifted back to me. This is about Margaret wanting revenge. I didn't react. Instead, I simply studied her expression. Anger had replaced the uncertainty she had shown earlier. But anger often appears when someone begins to lose control of a situation. Lauren, I said calmly, if I wanted revenge, I wouldn't be sitting here asking questions. Then what are you doing? Looking for clarity. She leaned forward slightly. About what? About my son's final weeks. The words landed quietly between us. For the first time since the meeting began, Lauren looked genuinely unsettled. I already told everyone everything I know, she said quickly. I'm sure you did. And Daniel's death was a medical emergency. I'm aware. Lauren's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. Then what exactly are you implying? I'm not implying anything, I replied. I'm asking. The difference mattered. Lauren's eyes flicked toward Thomas. Am I being accused of something? No, Thomas said. This is a discussion. But Lauren wasn't satisfied with that answer. She turned back to me. You're trying to turn my workplace into an interrogation. No, I said. I'm trying to understand several timelines. Her expression hardened again. What timelines? I spoke slowly. The insurance policy increase. Lauren froze for a moment. That was Daniel's decision, she said quickly. Was it? Yes. He signed the documents. I know. Lauren frowned slightly. Then why bring it up? Because it happened about a month before he died. That's not unusual. No, I agreed. Not by itself. Her eyes narrowed. What else? I opened my bag and placed Daniel's notebook gently on the table. Lauren stared at it. What is that? Something Daniel kept at his office. I opened the notebook to the page Emily had shown me. Lauren leaned forward. Her eyes scanned the handwriting. For the first time since she entered the room, the confident rhythm of her breathing changed. She recognized Daniel's writing immediately. Where did you get this? She asked quietly. From his office. That's private. So was the rest of his life. Lauren didn't answer. I turned the notebook slightly so she could read the lines more clearly. Asterisk review insurance update. Asterisk call lawyer again. Asterisk need to reconsider everything before it's too late. Lauren stared at the page. He never mentioned this to me, she said. Perhaps he planned to. That doesn't prove anything. No, I said. It doesn't. Her voice rose slightly. So why are we discussing it? Because Daniel had scheduled a meeting with an estate lawyer. Lauren blinked. What? The appointment was canceled the day before. Her expression tightened. I didn't know about that. That's possible. Lauren pushed the notebook slightly away. You're building theories out of random notes. Perhaps. But you're asking questions at my workplace, she said sharply. Yes, and using your ownership to pressure me. That's not what this is. Lauren shook her head. It absolutely is. Thomas remained silent, allowing the conversation to unfold. Lauren stood up suddenly. This conversation is inappropriate. Her chair slid slightly across the floor. If you have personal questions about Daniel, we can discuss them privately. We tried that, I said. Lauren's eyes flashed. That was a difficult time. You told me not to come back. Silence filled the room again. Lauren looked away briefly. Then she spoke more quietly. I was grieving. I'm sure you were. And I needed space. That's understandable. She crossed her arms. So why are we still here? I closed the notebook slowly. Because Daniel was planning something. Lauren stared at me. What do you mean? He was preparing to change something in his life. That's speculation. Maybe. But his notes suggest he was reconsidering decisions about money. Lauren's expression hardened again. You're suggesting he didn't trust me. I'm suggesting he was thinking. She let out a frustrated breath. This is absurd. Is it? Lauren's voice grew colder. You're trying to rewrite your son's marriage. No, I said. I'm trying to understand it. Her eyes burned with anger now. You think Daniel was unhappy with me? I think Daniel was thoughtful and careful. And when careful people start writing notes like this, I tapped the notebook lightly. They usually have reasons. Lauren looked down at the table. For a brief moment, something crossed her face. Not anger. Not grief. Something closer to fear. But it disappeared almost immediately. She straightened her shoulders. I've answered your questions. Not all of them. What else do you want? I looked at her calmly. The truth. Lauren let out another quiet laugh. The truth is Daniel had a stroke. I know. The truth is he died suddenly. I know. And the truth, she said sharply, is that you're trying to blame someone because you're grieving. I studied her carefully. That may be how it appears. Lauren grabbed her folder from the table. If this meeting is over, I have work to do. She turned toward the door. Lauren, she paused. Without turning around. Yes, I'm not accusing you of anything, I said quietly. But Daniel was trying to change something before he died. She didn't respond, and until I understand what that something was, I paused. This conversation isn't finished. Lauren stood still for several seconds. Then she opened the door and walked out of the room. Thomas exhaled slowly once she was gone. That escalated, he said. I closed Daniel's notebook carefully. Yes, I replied. But it also told us something. What? Lauren didn't expect Daniel to leave anything behind. Thomas nodded slowly. Outside the conference room, Lauren returned to her desk. From the window, I watched her sit down and stare at her computer screen. For the first time since I had arrived at the building, she no longer looked confident, because the questions she thought had been buried with Daniel were now sitting on the table in front of her, and they weren't going away. After Lauren left the conference room, the silence that remained felt strangely calm, not victorious, not satisfying, just quiet. Thomas Reed stood beside the window for a moment, watching the office floor below. Lauren had returned to her desk, but even from a distance, it was clear her composure had changed. The confident posture she had walked in with earlier that morning was gone. Now she sat very still, staring at her computer screen as if trying to process something she hadn't expected. Thomas turned back toward me. "Well," he said gently, "that was revealing." I closed Daniel's notebook and placed it carefully back into my bag. "Yes," I said. "It was." Thomas studied me for a moment. "What do you want to do next?" It was a fair question. In the corporate world, decisions are often immediate. Meetings lead to actions, reports lead to consequences. But this situation wasn't just business. It was my son, and the woman he had married. "I'm not here to destroy Lauren's career," I said quietly. Thomas nodded slowly. "I didn't think you were, but there will still need to be an internal review," he added. "Of course. Lauren's behavior within the company, her manipulation of narratives, her strategic positioning, her use of personal tragedy to influence perception would now be examined by leadership. That wasn't revenge. That was accountability. But my primary concern was no longer the company. It was Daniel, and understanding the life he had been living before everything ended. Later that afternoon, I left the building and walked slowly down the busy Boston street. The city looked exactly the same as it always had. Cars moved through traffic. People rushed between offices. Restaurants prepared for the evening crowd. Life continued. That simple fact used to feel cruel to me. Now it felt grounding. Daniel's absence would always be part of my life, but it didn't have to consume everything else. When I returned home to Connecticut that evening, the house felt different than it had a few days earlier. Not less empty, but less overwhelming. I made a cup of tea and sat in the living room, the same place where Daniel's childhood photograph rested on the bookshelf. I picked it up again. He was still smiling in the picture, young, confident, holding that old soccer ball under his arm. "You were trying to figure things out, weren't you?" I said softly. I thought about the notes he had written, the appointment he had scheduled with the estate lawyer, the quiet concern Emily had noticed in his voice weeks before his death. Daniel had been asking questions, trying to understand something, maybe something about money, maybe something about trust, maybe something about the person he had married. But whatever answers he had been searching for, he had run out of time. And now the responsibility to understand those questions had fallen to me. Over the next several weeks, Robert continued reviewing Daniel's financial records and estate documents. Nothing illegal appeared, no evidence of fraud, no hidden manipulation of legal paperwork. Lauren had acted quickly, but technically within her rights as Daniel's spouse. Sometimes the truth is frustratingly ordinary. Still, the investigation revealed something important. Daniel had indeed been planning changes to his financial structure. The canceled appointment with the estate lawyer had been part of a broader plan to reorganize several of his assets. Why? We would never know for certain. But Daniel's notebook had already given me one possible answer. Asterisk, need to reconsider everything before it's too late. Perhaps Daniel had simply been thinking about the future, about protecting his work, about making sure his life's efforts were directed toward the things he valued most. He had always been that kind of person, careful, thoughtful, kind. As for Lauren, her promotion review at Reed Financial Consulting was delayed, not canceled, delayed. Thomas and the executive team wanted time to review the workplace concerns that had surfaced. Lauren continued working at the company, but the quiet certainty she once carried through those office halls had changed. She now knew exactly who stood at the top of the organization. And more importantly, she knew that the woman she had once dismissed as a burden was not as powerless as she had believed. We never had another confrontation. There was no dramatic final argument, no courtroom battle, no public collapse. Life simply moved forward. Lauren focused on rebuilding her professional reputation, and I focused on honoring Daniel's memory. 6 months later, I created the ***, Daniel Miller Foundation ***. The foundation supports community architecture projects, schools, public centers, and affordable housing developments designed to bring people together, exactly the kind of work Daniel had loved most. Every year, the foundation sponsors young architects who want to design spaces that improve people's lives. Whenever I meet those young designers, I see pieces of Daniel in their enthusiasm, their ideas, their belief that the world can be built better. And every time I see that spark, I know something important. Daniel's life didn't end with that hospital room. It continues in the spaces he imagined, in the projects he inspired, and in the lessons he left behind. Because sometimes the greatest legacy a person leaves isn't money. It isn't property. It isn't control. It's the quiet impact they have on the people who continue living after them. And Daniel Miller left more of that than he ever realized. Losing someone you love changes the way you see the world. For a long time after Daniel died, I believed grief was the most powerful emotion a person could experience. It felt like standing in the middle of an ocean with no land in sight. But over time, I learned something else. Grief doesn't only take things away from us. Sometimes it reveals things. It reveals the strength we didn't know we had. It reveals the truth about the people around us. And sometimes it reveals the kind of legacy a person has truly left behind. When Lauren closed that door and told me to leave my son's house, she believed she had ended my role in her life. But life doesn't work that way. Relationships, choices, and consequences are connected in ways we don't always see in the moment. And most importantly, kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. For many years, I kept my success quiet because I believed relationships should be built on sincerity rather than status. I still believe that, but I also learned something important through this experience. You don't need to raise your voice to protect your dignity. You don't need revenge to reclaim your strength. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply standing calmly in the truth of who you are. Daniel believed in building spaces where people could feel safe and connected. That belief lives on through the foundation created in his name, and through every young architect who continues the work he loved. If there's one thing I hope people take from this story, it's this. The people who truly matter in your life are not the ones who stay only when things are easy. They are the ones who value you when there is nothing to gain. Because in the end, integrity and compassion outlast every temporary victory. If this story moved you, I'd truly love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? And what time is it where you are right now? Have you ever experienced a moment when someone underestimated you and later realized they were wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, truth, and family, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. Thank you for listening.